Good evening, everyone, and a warm Winnipeg welcome to all of you. I'm Judith Newman, graduate of the University of Winnipeg, class of 71, and current president of the University of Winnipeg Alumni Association. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our third speaker event of 2023, and I thank you for taking the time to be with us. It is always a privilege to provide an opportunity to highlight our accomplished University of Winnipeg alumni and find out about their personal story. What influence the University of Winnipeg may have had on them, what inspired them, and has led to their success, and what wisdom they can impart to present-day students and recent grads. Today, we have the pleasure of chatting with a very distinguished University of Winnipeg graduate, Dr. Jordan Sloshower. Dr. Sloshower was born and raised in Winnipeg. He is a 2002 graduate of the University of Winnipeg Collegiate and received his Bachelor of Science degree in bioanthropology from the University of Winnipeg in 2005. He went on to receive a Master's of Science degree at the University of Edinburgh in medical anthropology in 2007 and an MD from Yale School of Medicine in 2014. He is co-director of West Rock Wellness Clinic in New Haven and a clinical instructor in the Yale Department of Psychiatry. He has a deep interest in the ceremonial uses of plant medicines, Buddhist philosophy, and integrative approaches to wellness. At this time, it's my pleasure to turn things over to Alumni Council member and alum, Dr. Fred Appel, who is joining us from Princeton, New Jersey. He will introduce our speaker and be our moderator for the remainder of this event. Thank you, Fred.
Thanks very much, Judith. I want to thank Judith for her leadership on the University of Winnipeg Alumni Council. I want to thank the other council members for their support. And I want to thank Evan and his colleagues at the University of Winnipeg Media Services Department that have provided invaluable technical support to make this event and others this spring possible. This event this evening is our third and final springtime, early spring conversation with a distinguished US-based University of Winnipeg alum. We've had a series of wonderful discussions, and if any of you in webinar land attended one of our first two conversations, welcome back. And if you didn't, welcome. And I look forward to this evening's conversation with Dr. Jordan Sloshower. Jordan, how are you this evening?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Fred and Judith, for the invitation to be here. It's an honor.
I'm delighted that you're able to give us your time this evening. Jordan, you're speaking to us from New Haven, Connecticut, is that right?
That is correct, yeah. It's where I've been since 2008.
2008. So that's an impressive series of plants you have behind you. I mean, great foliage action you've got there.
Well, I've had a few years of pandemic Zoom land to work on the Zoom background. So
haven't we all? Haven't we all? So Jordan, let me ask you. Thank you again for taking part in this event. You are a Winnipeg native. I imagine that you must keep in touch with folks, perhaps extended family in Winnipeg. Do you ever make your way back to the Peg from time to time?
Oh, absolutely. All my family is there. Some of them are on the call now. And,
is that so? Who might we count among the participants of this webinar in your family?
I believe my parents are in attendance, and my sister and my grandmother as well.
Hello, Mom and Dad. Hello, Sloshower family. We're glad that you're able to come, and that's terrific. Tell me, Jordan. So I grew up in River Heights. Born and raised there. What part of the city are you from?
I think we also River Heights.
Okay. All right. This is getting a little granular, and please forgive me, webinar participants, but I must find out what street Jordan grew up on.
I grew up on Beaverbrook, and played with the River Heights Cardinals growing up, and
Fantastic. Beaverbrook. Okay, so that's near Lanark. Am I wrong or am I right?
that's right. That's the area,
That's fantastic.
and that's still where I go back to when I do come home.
Fantastic, fantastic. And so you grew up in River Heights, Beaverbrook. I remember the area very well. I grew up on Queenston, by the way, between Grant and Mathers, so a little bit further up in River Heights. And I went to Grant Park High School. I understand that your high school career was at the University of Winnipeg at the Collegiate. Did you spend your whole high school time in the Collegiate?
From grades 10 through 12, yeah, I had been at Joseph Wolinski, which now I guess the Asper campus for a couple of years, and then moved over to UW Collegiate for grade 10, and was there through grade 12, and then stayed on at UW for 3 more years after that.
Fantastic. So what was I mean, it's been a while now, but what was the motivation to move over to the Collegiate? Did you find that a number of your friends had moved over there? Were you attracted to the prospect of the educational experience there, the quality of the education? Do you recall what the prime driver was?
Yeah, and it ended up being, I think, a bit of a theme. I think and there were a lot of people in our community and people in grades ahead of me who were making that transition, and we were hearing positive things, but especially I think the self-directed nature of the education there, kind of a choose your own adventure. You don't have to plug in, I guess goes along with the U of W be yourself kind of motto, I think. And they were, and of course there's pros and cons of being at a normal big high school, and U of W's Collegiate is small, but
yes,
and maybe doesn't have as much school spirit, rah as other maybe you had at Grant Park, but definitely the self-directed nature and kind of adult learning, and maybe as a less mature answer, getting out early was a pro. But I ended up on the basketball team for a few years, and so would spend my afternoons, around the gym. And
fantastic. So as many of the people on the webinar understand, and as you recall, growing up in Winnipeg, going to high school, whether at the Collegiate or elsewhere, when faced with a decision about applying to university, there was always the binary choice for most of us. There was the urban University of Winnipeg, and that there was the suburban, bigger campus of the University of Manitoba. I mean, in my era, which was the 1980s, very few members of my high school cohort considered going anywhere other than those two institutions. Was that true as well in your cohort? I mean, you're much younger than me. We're talking early 2000s here. Was there another option, or was it always sort of between the U of W and the U of M for you when you were approaching high school graduation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think most of my peers made that binary choice. We did have a few who ended up in other places. I was definitely thinking a little more broadly, and actually there was part of me that actually was interested in leaving Winnipeg at that time, and I think McGill was actually kind of at the top of my list. I even applied. So my grandfather went to the University of Michigan on a hockey scholarship, actually, and so I actually applied there, and the University of Minnesota. I even, at the time we had one friend in our class whose sister went to Harvard, and so that I had some thoughts about like the Ivy League at that time. I figured out that would be way too expensive at that point, so I didn't seriously consider it, but I did apply to McGill and some other places, and my parents gave me some good wisdom at the time, I think, and we they kind of foreshadowed the future. They said to me, George, I think you should stay in Winnipeg, get your undergraduate education here. You got good schools here, and you'll go away for graduate school. And that's pretty much what happened.
They were clairvoyant. They were clairvoyant. I mean, that's exactly what happened. You caught up on your desire for life abroad and a little bit later. So you did choose to remain in Winnipeg, and I'm sure your family was very happy to have you with them for another 3 or 4 years. So let me ask you a bit, Jordan, before we move closer to the present, about your U of W experience. I know that you majored eventually in anthropology, or bioanthropology to be more exact. Were you experimenting quite a bit, in your first couple of years, taking all manner of courses, or was the path to that major quite clear early on for you?
Try to transport myself back into that moment. I had a few interests at that time. I mean, actually, going into grade 12, I think I was still even thinking about things like astrophysics. I had, a childhood fascination with space, astronauts, like many kids, but that kind of persisted in me for a while, and I thought about pursuing even that. But I had this an interest in the human condition, and there was at least part of me going into university that was thinking about medical school, but and covering some of the required courses. But the truth is, I was not wholeheartedly gung-ho about medicine, and part of that was I just at that point didn't have a clear idea of what I would do as a doctor. I didn't really see myself as kind of a doc on the corner, which actually just as of a few weeks ago now I am. But for many years I couldn't see that. So I kind of was like, thought I might, maybe it was partially my family's influence, thinking you're good at science, you'd be good people person, be a good doctor. Yeah. But it was kind of still open to things, and it was very interested in anthropology and, as I said, the human condition, and also biology. One of my influential professors, Nancy Lodeman, who passed away, unfortunately, I took chordate zoology, and was, for a while there, I was thinking of ditching medicine in favor of being like a field biologist or an ecologist, something like that. And that reflected, which still is very present, a deep appreciation and connection with nature, and caring about the natural world. So it was kind of focus on humanity, focus on ecology. It was a bit of a toss up there. So pursued a few different things there.
I'm sorry to hear about the recent passing of one of your mentors and professors, Nancy Lodeman. Did I get her last name correct?
Yeah.
In the biology department. Can you do one or two other professors come to mind who influenced you in particular to major in bioanthropology?
Well, that was a new major at the time, and I was looking for a way to kind of combine a few of my different interests, kind of get a few of the medical school prereqs, but also take anthropology courses. And so yes, Professor George Fulford, who I believe is also on the call this evening.
Wonderful.
I took his intro anthropology course, and that continued to spark my interest. And when that major came about, that was a nice way of combining things. I ended up taking a few more classes with him, as well as some of the other profs in the anthropology department.
Yes.
And just to say a couple things about Professor Fulford and how he influenced my journey was, I mean, of course, the classes stimulated my interest in different cultures, and that was that's something that still carries forward in my work with psychedelic medicine and understanding indigenous uses of those medicines. So certainly a cultural anthropology piece that still lives on today. But one thing that I'll always be indebted to Professor Fulford for was, as I was actually finishing my time at UW, and we met often in his office, and I think that's a key thing about UW that I also remember was that professors were very accessible because classes were smaller, and was able to develop relationships with some of the professors and had office hours. And so I used to go and visit with Dr. Fulford, and towards the end of my time there, I was thinking big. I actually applied for a Rhodes Scholarship because I knew I wanted to do grad school, and was thinking about that. I believe he and others supported my application. I actually made it through a couple of the rounds in that, but ultimately I didn't get that Rhodes Scholarship, which of course is fairly prestigious. And but it was Dr. Fulford who said, "So what are you going to do next?" And he was aware of something called the Commonwealth Scholarship, which was another similar scholarship program that I was not aware of, and that actually allowed you to actually pick the institution within the Commonwealth that you wanted to go to, so not be limited to Oxford. And
yes,
in my Rhodes application, I had come across the University of Edinburgh and some of the professors of medical anthropology there, whose work intrigued me around. They were studying largely HIV and TB infectious diseases and some of the politics around that, access to medicine. And I had written about them in my Rhodes application. And then when I found out about the Commonwealth, I was like, well, I could just apply to go directly there. And similarly, didn't know how good of a shot I had, but Dr. Fulford encouraged me to definitely apply. And so I finished my time at the UW. I submitted that application. I packed my bags and went to Central America for 6 months. And
was this just a backpacking adventure with some friends or solo?
It was solo. Solo. I definitely had gotten the travel bug while I was in college, and was clear that was something I wanted to do. And
Did you have any Spanish?
Not much. I had never learned Spanish growing up because, of course, we were learning French, and I learned some Hebrew growing up as well, but not Spanish. Yeah. But once I knew I was going to go on this trip, I actually did take a little intro to Spanish summer course before heading off. But I definitely learned in Guatemala Spanish, living in a household there and taking some lessons.
Yes,
which of course has been useful here in the US, where Spanish is much more prevalent. But just to finish the little story, so
yes,
I went and was traveling and doing some volunteer work, and had applied with that Commonwealth, and kind of was like, well, we'll just see what happens. I'm going to go do this, and then figure out my next steps. I didn't feel like a need to jump right into the next step. And I happened to be in Mexico, and eventually spoke to my parents, and they said, we got this funny letter here that you got the scholarship. And couldn't believe it. But that really definitely bent the arc of my trajectory in education, and led to so many things. So
fantastic.
Thank you, George, for encouraging me. And I think the theme of that has carried forward a little bit is just being willing to take some risks. And so for those who are current students, or definitely encourage you to just take a chance, think big. If you get turned down. It's not the end of the world. There's always the next thing. And I always found that just the process of applying, going for the big dream led to other good things.
6 months in Central America. Without fluent Spanish at the beginning, I guess that is a bold endeavor as well. And did your experiences in Guatemala and elsewhere in Central America and Mexico motivate you all the more to continue your studies in anthropology?
Yes, definitely in medical anthropology, especially, and just on the boldness. I sometimes think back to, not only going there alone, but at that time, I went there with no cell phone.
I was going to ask you about cell phones, because when you said you called your parents and they told you about the funny looking envelope, I was wondering if this was already like the early cell phone era, or was it just pre-cell phone, or what?
I think some people had maybe iPhones, or I don't think iPhone, but iPod, and I didn't even have. I literally went there with a film camera and a Discman, and that was it. And I think of that today. I was like, well, going anywhere without your iPhone seems crazy.
No. I mean, grown-up children, young adults traveling abroad are often in touch with their parents and their grandparents and their friends daily or even hourly, and they're trackable in a way that was impossible when you were in Central America, and certainly when I was backpacking in Southeast Asia in the 1980s. These were eras when your parents didn't know where you were for long stretches of time, and that was both very good and very bad, I think.
But there were a couple influential things that happened on that trip, I think, that influenced my path. I mean, one, so my dad, as I was getting ready for that trip, he actually gave me a book called Don Juan, A Yaqui Way of Knowledge by Carlos Castaneda, and thought that would be of interest to me. And of course, this is a book about it's kind of a quasi real account, but it basically a story about an anthropologist who encounters this Yaqui Mexican shaman who teaches him about plant medicine and about psychoactive plant allies, and sort of, so down there I read that book, which of course, I mean, still at this point I had no conception of that psychedelics would have anything to do with my actual career, but it definitely continued to stimulate an interest in just that area. But even more than that, at that time, I was seeing obviously poverty for in a very real way, in a different way than we see in Winnipeg. And I was reading, someone gave me a book called Bitter Fruit. Wonderful story about the political history of Guatemala and the meddling of the U.S. government in Guatemalan politics, and the involvement of the big banana fruit companies, and how this all led to essentially a coup. The U.S. supported coups, which happened in several Central American countries, and this was kind of a big eye opener for me. And just kind of continued to open my eyes to the connections between politics, economics, and health and well-being, which very much influenced my interest in medical anthropology, which, again, I had already applied for medical anthropology, so it was already there, but actually seeing it, seeing how these things played out in a real world context was very powerful. And I was very influenced by the work of Paul Farmer, and also read while I was down there Mountains Beyond Mountains, which is another amazing biography of him. And Dr. Farmer passed away recently as well, losing my mentors.
For the webinar participants who might not know the name Paul Farmer, he was a most distinguished medical doctor and an anthropologist, a trained anthropologist as well, and also the founder of a wonderful not-for-profit NGO called Partners in Health, which offers medical services to people all over the world, first and foremost in Haiti. And I know he did die much too young, just a short while ago. It must have been a great inspiration for you.
He was at that time, and that was the first, I said earlier, I never had a vision of being a doctor, actually, because I was like, well, just being on the corner, I don't know, it just didn't spark my interest. But actually learning about Dr. Farmer was actually the first time in my life that I was like, oh, I could see myself doing that. What he does. Not exactly, he's, one of these people who it's hard to understand how one accomplishes as much as someone like him, but his basic idea of combining the practice of medicine and global health and political analysis and economics, and really taking bold, he was committed to social justice and having a critical lens of understanding how health outcomes are not just biological, but determined by these social factors. And so that really crystallized kind of the next few years and my interest in pursuing medical anthropology and global health.
So this is very interesting, Jordan. As I hear you speak about your trajectory at the U of W and then traveling for 6 months in Central America, I'm starting to think this is someone who looks like he's going to become an anthropologist, a bioanthropologist, or some other. And yet the trajectory does lead to medical school. So I'm wondering, you received the Commonwealth Scholarship, and after your sojourn in Central America, you do move to Edinburgh to do a master's in medical anthropology. Were you persuaded when you started that following Paul Farmer's example and becoming a medical doctor was what you wanted to do, or did that come a little bit later?
I think that whole year, it was kind of a question in my mind of, do I want to pursue a PhD in medical anthropology, or do I want to go to medical school, or do I maybe want to actually combine those things in some way? And I was kind of wavering. I really had a wonderful year in Edinburgh. It was probably the best academic year I ever had, as far as just really the beauty of at least that program. Maybe it's unique to Edinburgh, but
it's a little chilly, a little rainy and chilly, isn't it, in the winter?
Yeah, but it's a great town for sure. And just the program was it was just really self-directed. I was really able to just dive into the things that I was really interested in. But doing the thesis at the end, which was a good experience, but that was actually the thing that made me realize, what? I spent like 2-3 months kind of holed up in my room with stacks of books, intellectually stimulating for sure, but kind of isolating. And I was like, you do a PhD, this is what it's going to be for a few years. And it's like, I think I need that I want to impact things on a human level. And so let me see about, I think I'm going to pursue medicine and kind of bring in the anthropology into that and the global health, and kind of started to see that I could have it all. I think that was what I was interested in, was not choosing this or that. And it seemed like going to medical school would be the way to potentially have it all.
The path to medical school, did you take another hiatus after your year in Edinburgh, or did you plunge right in?
Well, so towards the end of that year, I decided, no, I am going to apply to medical schools. And it's funny once I met my colleagues at Yale, and these, the way here in the Ivy League, and kids have these, pre-med, all the mentorship and strategizing for their application strategies and all this. I sat there in Edinburgh with a book of all the medical schools that they put out, and just kind of sat there on my own, just flipping through
Yeah.
pages and reading, just thinking, oh, would this be a place I might like to go? And I came across the program at Yale, and they had this whole thing called the Yale system. And it really reminded me actually of the philosophy at the UW. It was very much a self-directed approach to medical education. So not, it was not about standardized testing. It was not about forcing you through this rigorous, crazy process. It was a lot more, we want to support, creating leaders in medicine. So we understand, and this is not the program, if you're the type of student who really needs to be shepherded through everything, this isn't a place for you. We want self-motivated folks who have particular interests that they want to, so many resources were available.
Yeah.
So that program definitely got a big X. But again, the truth is, really had no idea what chance I stood of actually getting in.
Yeah.
But
that I had no idea that Yale had such a focus on self-directed study in its medical school. Did that mean that it accepts very few new students every year? Does it keep the numbers down in order to ensure the sort of intimate self-directed nature of the program?
They did. It was classes of, it's about 100. So it's not tiny, but it's not big either. I think it's probably grown a little bit over the years, but it's definitely a modest class size.
Was the Yale medical school program, well, let me just back up a moment and ask if you considered Canadian medical school options. I remember reading years ago that McMaster University in Hamilton had a very interesting and innovative medical education philosophy. I don't know if it still does. Was the prospect of medical education in Canada something that you considered or tempted you at all?
It was, and I did have actually some good connections in Winnipeg and with the U of M, and had actually, again, Dr. Fulford connected me with a colleague of his, Nicole Reese, who was a wonderful family physician who did a lot of work with Indigenous communities up north.
Yes.
And there was at one point, I actually went with her up north on a journey. And so, it was definitely clear, and had made a few other good connections. And so it was clear that there was some excellent work in global health, both abroad, but also within Manitoba happening there. And I did apply in Winnipeg and considered that. I also still went back to McGill, was considering McGill. They interestingly had some stringent requirements around. So I did a 3-year bachelor's at UW, and they actually required you to have a 4-year bachelor degree. Okay. So I was applying with a 3-year bachelor and a master's, and they actually didn't accept that. So I actually was not even able to apply to McGill, which is kind of funny.
That's crazy. The 1-year master's program was not considered equivalent to a 4th year of a undergraduate degree.
It wasn't. I even had tried to have a special call, but I think, or I had was trying to persuade them, and it didn't work. But after being in Edinburgh, I think I got accustomed to kind of this, well, maybe big old university kind of feel, and just the nice thing there was just it was so much interdisciplinary work. So many things were accessible to you within that campus. And I kind of really liked that, and was in some ways shooting for having that experience, especially given that my interests were quite interdisciplinary. So I was really looking for places where was I going to have access to the anthropology department, was actually a big question, and what was going on with global health. And so those were some of the considerations when I was applying.
So, Jordan, your entry into the medical school at Yale University coincided with your first period of residency in the United States. And I wonder what that was like, the move to the United States. Was there a nightmarish sort of immigration visa application thing you had to go through? Did the medical school help you, advise you as to which student visa to apply for? Was it easy, or was it daunting?
So I'm lucky by birth that my dad is actually an American citizen, and so I was a dual
Okay.
born a dual citizen, or had dual citizenship. So I've been very fortunate in not having to deal with a lot of the barriers that I would have otherwise.
So you've been a dual citizen since your birth, or since you were very young?
Yeah. Thanks, Dad.
Excellent. And I guess so your dad has been an expat American living in Canada for quite a few decades now.
Indeed, although he recently became a Canadian citizen only a couple of years ago.
Okay, at long last. Okay, no excuse now. He's got to vote.
That's right.
That's great. Okay, so you were able to circumvent immigration bureaucracies, because of the dual citizen status. So tell me about your first experiences in the Yale Medical School. Was it all that you had expected? Was it as self-directed and intimate a sort of educational environment as the UW was?
Well, yes, and I think the big difference was there was just being at a place like Yale. There was so many resources available. I mean, at times it was overwhelming, but I remember, at U of W, there were things like summer programs and study abroad, but they were all came with a pretty high cost. And the benefit of being at Yale was they really are well funded to help their students have those kind of experiences. And so having kind of stayed in Winnipeg for my earlier years, and just the kind of person I am, I was highly motivated to take advantage of all the opportunities available to me. And so I did and of course my interest was in global health coming into this. So I was very focused on, and that was part of the appeal, was could I actually spend a fair bit of time? And there was other students I was aware of that had medical students at Yale who started NGOs in other countries and were actually spending significant amounts of time out of the US and still completing their medical education. And so I was pretty motivated. And after my first year of medical school, I went to India, and I actually collaborated with a U of M professor, Jamie Blanchard, who was doing HIV work in southern India. So was able to take the time and go and do that. And then so throughout my time at Yale, which actually was 6 years of medical school, I extended. It was the norm there to take one extra year, because they encourage students to take an extra year and pursue an academic project or get involved in research, do something of that nature. And I ended up actually heading back to Latin America and spent 6 months actually in South America, doing a few different things, clinical opportunities, and traveling again and learning even more Spanish. And
tell me more about the clinical opportunities that you took advantage of in Latin America. So was this fully funded by the Yale University Medical School? And were you working in an NGO? Were you working in a private hospital? What was the scene there?
Yeah, well, Yale had a few different relationships in different countries and could send their students to specific placements. And they had one in Ecuador, in a small rural clinic, and then that was like general medicine. and then they had one in psychiatry in Peru. And by this point, those were kind of my two. I was still, interested in infectious disease and the Paul Farmer kind of model. And then my interests were also kind of shifting towards psychiatry. And so by that point, I was like, oh, this is great. I can go and do, a little of both abroad. And
why were your interests, Jordan, shifting in the direction of psychiatry?
Good question. Psychiatry, in my view, is the most humanistic of the fields of medicine. And I think based on that same interest in anthropology, sort of understanding humanity, what drives us, how do the cultures affect us, what are the different cultures of medicine, how do, politics and economics impact people, people's stories, I think was what, I started realizing, yes, I'm interested in infectious disease, but it was more this sort of political side of it that was appealing. I was not as interested in the pathogens themselves, some of the the science of it. The same with in general medicine. I was a little less interested in managing people's chemistry and diving into that. I was really interested in people's stories, understanding their backgrounds, understanding suffering more broadly. And I'd always been back to UW, and another influential teacher, Phyllis Webster's, I think is on the call. I had this interest in the humanities, took poetry, and was always interested in interdisciplinary aspects. And so psychiatry kind of, in my view, is where a lot of these things come together. And I was starting to see that, but I didn't have a great view of how I could do global health and mental health, how those things fit together. But that was one of the, having this opportunity in Peru was a place where I was able to start to see, how do we actually roll out modern mental health interventions and also community-based mental health. I was seeing that actually Paul Farmer's model that Partners in Health was using about community-based care to treat HIV and TB was actually the exact same model that is effective for dealing with mental health issues in a range of lower resource settings. And so that was really cool. And I got to work actually in a few settings within Peru, both in Lima and in a larger hospital, as well as in Ayacucho, a smaller town, and a clinic there. And got to travel a bunch more. And I was similarly to like how I sat in my room and picked medical schools. I was in Peru and was like thinking about going back to finish medical school. And I was like, there's just so much that I want to do. And I wrote to the deans from Peru and said, is it possible to take another one of these extra years? And a little beyond that, I came up with a specific plan to actually, what I wanted to do was survey actually courses of interest at Yale, especially graduate level anthropology courses, as well as I ended up taking painting and Spanish and a few other just kind of things. But it was, again, kind of taking advantage of everything that was on offer at Yale, and really, had wanted it, again, coming in to maybe combine medical anthropology and my medical studies. And so that was still present there. And so I had this whole proposal and they accepted it. So.
Right. That's great. I was going to ask you about your connection with the Department of Anthropology at Yale while you were in medical school. And it sounds like you were afforded the flexibility of taking such courses, as well as courses in the humanities.
Yeah, I was. And that was a good experience for sure.
So, so Jordan, it sounds like the experience in Peru, while part of the medical school program, drew you towards psychiatry, and I suppose helped make you decide to pursue a residency in psychiatry, right? To furthering your medical education, yes?
Yeah. Shortly after, I think that that experience in Peru, I was increasingly thinking that psychiatry was going to be the way for me to go.
So I have my grown-up daughters have some friends who are in medical school, and I've heard secondhand a little bit about the system of placement in residency programs, and I gather that it is a rather large bureaucratic system that involves you applying and rank ordering the residency programs you wish to study in, and there's a centralized system that assigns you to a residency program. Is that at all accurate? And was that your experience in getting placed in a residency program in psychiatry in New Haven?
You're right about the system there. I think I definitely was quite privileged in being a Yale medical student who was, it's a strong position to be in. And
Sure.
I had some dream of going to California, which had dated back from some years, but in the end, the truth was Yale, again, the residency had the same kind of philosophy as the medical school, as far as really providing less structure. And again, the same thread from the collegiate of, it was much more, had much more of that choose your own adventure. We're going to provide you protected time to pursue your interests, your specific interests. And that, for me, there was actually nowhere else that really offered that. And so I was motivated to stay at Yale. And actually, it turned my other great mentors that I've had, Dr. Robert Rohrbaugh here at Yale. So he actually was the director of the psychiatry residency program, but he also was the director of the Office of Global Health in the medical school. So it's the same guy who supported me to go on these global health electives, then was also the head of the residency program. And so that, again, was kind of a cue of, oh no, this is the right spot for me, because he's going to continue to support me in pursuing my passions here.
Okay, so if I'm accepted in the residency program in psychiatry at Yale University School of Medicine, where am I working during the day? What's my assignment? What's a typical day looking like?
I mean, first year you're doing a lot of different rotations in medicine, psychiatry, neurology. So it was all mostly within the hospital here. And then as you progress, there was a few different practice locations, including the Veterans Hospital, where I ended up spending quite a bit of time and doing some of my psychedelic research was based there. And they also have a community-based mental health center. So it was several different settings. Like most residencies try to provide you with exposure to different settings.
I see. So the main base is was and is a Yale University teaching hospital in New Haven, Connecticut, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you mentioned the beginnings of a pursuit of research in psychedelic medicine. So tell me how you became interested in this particular area. And here we're drawing ever closer to the present, because I do want to ask you about your present work at the West Rock Wellness Clinic. But first, tell me where this interest in this branch of research developed.
Yeah, it's a good story. I think it's always interesting to different versions of telling the story. But I referenced earlier that my dad had given me the Carlos Castaneda book, and so this interest was kind of like a dormant, not even dormant, but it was more of like, and it was an interest. It wasn't something that I ever again had a clear idea of that it would be my work, but it was something that I thought was very interesting. And when I was traveling in South America in Peru, I was also learning and again was interested in ethnobotany, this is something that I again, even from my days when I mentioned I was interested in ecology and anthropology. So that's actually ethnobotany is really, when I say that, I mean it's the relationships between humans and plants, and in particular psychoactive plants. And being in Peru and Bolivia and Ecuador, these connections are very prominent. For instance, like coca leaves is, considered a sacred plant. It's used ubiquitously. Went to like a coca museum and again was learning about the politics, and it was very much right up my alley with medical anthropology.
Mm-hmm.
I was also increasingly aware of ayahuasca, which is which is a psychoactive plant brew home to the Amazon. And that was also being mentioned and even available in tourist circles, though I was aware that this is quite a powerful substance. And so while I was in Peru, kind of learned a little bit about it, didn't experience that. So again, these kind of interests were percolating. I was still going to pursue global health, and when I got into Yale, so kind of a couple things. When I got in for the residency, I should say, a couple of things happened. One was the field of psychedelic medicine started to take off again back in 2006 at Johns Hopkins. There were some of the first, well, I shouldn't say first, but some studies were being done in humans and being published. And of course, there had been earlier psychedelic work that happened in the 50s and 60s, especially even in Saskatchewan. Our neighbor with Humphrey Osmond was a pioneer in this area.
Mm-hmm.
But then things became dormant when psychedelics were scheduled in 1970, and the research very much went underground or ceased. And then it was starting to pick back up. And so right around the time when I went into residency, that was gaining momentum. I became aware of this research, and I also I had an opportunity to actually participate in an ayahuasca ceremony. And so it's kind of and that was extremely impactful. And so some of those dormant interests were very much peaked, and especially from this therapeutic perspective, I was like, wow, this is really something extremely interesting. I have no idea really what this is all about, but I'm so fascinated to learn more about this. And at the same time, became aware that, my own intuition was this is a really powerful medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And beyond that, then the research was starting to come out about it. And I was, so I don't remember the exact order, but I continue, basically that is kind of tipped my trajectory.
So I have so many questions to ask you about psychedelics. Just before I do, Jordan, I just want to address the webinar participants just for a moment. If any of you have any questions of your own for Jordan about his current work, about his background, please don't hesitate to type them in to the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen, and they will pop up, and I'll be able to see them, and I'll be able to pass them along to Jordan. So please don't be shy, don't hesitate. But if you don't, it's okay, because I have oodles of questions of my own. Jordan, let me ask you, maybe I should just ask you as a non-specialist and a non-scientist, could you maybe just define what a psychedelic substance is, which is related to my question about what psychedelic medicine is?
Yeah, so it's interesting, because what a psychedelic is and defining the boundaries of that is actually a contested area. It's not completely clear exactly what should and should not be counted in that category. However, for the most part, at least right now, so I think the easiest way to explain it would be that a group of compounds called the classical psychedelics are typically the psychedelics that bind to serotonin 2A receptors, and they include some of the better known psychedelics that include psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, mescaline, which is the active ingredient in both peyote and San Pedro cactus. So these compounds are all considered classical psychedelics. And a fair bit of the research in the field of psychedelic medicine focuses on those compounds, but not exclusively, because we have compounds like MDMA, which is on the street known as ecstasy. That's not a classical psychedelic; it's an amphetamine-based compound with psychedelic properties. So again, by that term, I think we're talking about compounds that significantly alter consciousness in certain characteristic ways. Of course, many other substances alter consciousness, even alcohol.
Right, or caffeine.
But there's some, and caffeine and coca and so many others.
Yes.
But it seems to have to, do with alteration of perception, consciousness, thought patterns, alterations of space and time. There's, kind of, but as you point out, that even for instance, ketamine, which is currently a increasingly used drug, I would say, and again, it's pure synthetic. It's not a classical psychedelic, but it has psychedelic properties.
So Jordan, would it be fair to assume that a classic psychedelic is a substance that is either plant-based or sort of fungal-based, like a mushroom or some derivative of a plant?
Yes, but not all, because again, that term is kind of linked to this specific action on serotonin 2A receptors. So all those drugs I mentioned, they act sort of through the same mechanism, and so while the effects are definitely not all the same, they share a certain broad
I understand
characteristics. Whereas you have plenty of other plant-based substances that alter consciousness that in through different mechanisms, like salvia divinorum, for instance. People may have heard of salvia. That actually works through opioid receptors, but it's a plant-based, and it is again, whether you call that a psychedelic, it definitely alters consciousness in very profound ways.
Now, you recounted an early experience, an early encounter with psychedelics, during which you thought to yourself, "Wow, this seems like it would be, and is a very powerful medicine." I imagine that. Psychedelics have been used for a long time by indigenous peoples, and I wonder if they have used psychedelics as explicitly as medicines. Presumably, they have been used for many other purposes, spiritual, religious, and whatnot.
Yes, what you said is true.
So I suppose, and all of these multiple uses in indigenous communities have been, shall we say, interconnected?
Well, there's such a rich history of indigenous use of plants in general and psychoactive plants, and it's really impossible to characterize that in any broad strokes. But I would say for sure there's long traditions of using them, as you said, for ceremonial purposes, as well as in a number of cultures for healing purposes explicitly. And of course, it's in some of the interesting things is it's not, today it's all about the person suffering takes the medicine, whereas in certain shamanic cultures, it was actually the healer takes the psychedelic plant in order to help diagnose and understand the problem through that alteration of consciousness, enabling them to sort of see energetic illnesses, spiritual causes, etc. So definitely different frameworks that were and still continue to operate in many places.
You mentioned that there was some early research with psychedelic substances in universities, in say US or European universities decades ago, and it just sort of stopped. Why was that? Was it because these substances were associated with the counterculture, with illegality, with a youth culture? Why was it that it sort of went underground?
again, I think there's different histories out there, but I think the narrative I'm most familiar with is that when Richard Nixon, with the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, all psychedelics became Schedule 1, meaning by definition, they had no medical uses, approved medical uses, and the research permits eventually, it just became both increasingly, I think, difficult for researchers to get the approvals, and it became just taboo in a way to be working with psychedelic drugs, and that in some way was the fallout of the 60s, and how, you know, some ways propaganda around the harms of reefer madness, the harms that LSD will blow holes in your brain, and all of this. So it just became very unfavorable to do that research, and eventually essentially just stopped for a good 20-25 years. And then in the 90s and then 2000s, just very slowly started back again at select institutions. And then, as we kind of, some of us may know, is now kind of exploding all over the place.
So it's exploding even if the legal regulatory framework remains the way it was, or has that changed as well in the United States and perhaps even in Canada?
Essentially, no. All psychedelics remain at this point Schedule 1 drugs federally, meaning so they're restricted for research purposes only. That said, I think the regulatory environments, both with the FDA and at institutions, have, it's become a little easier to obtain research permits to use those substances. And then, as far more broadly, now we've just in the last few years, we're starting to see regulatory changes at the state and municipal levels, but not federally. So, and this has gotten some press around decriminalization initiatives, and in Oregon and Colorado, actually statewide legal frameworks to access psilocybin therapy services, or not even therapy, but psilocybin services as they're being called. And in Canada as well, actually, there's I think federally, again, it hasn't budged as far as them being scheduled in the highest category, but there's a program called TheraSil, and in Canada, there's actually been increasingly medical exemptions being granted to terminal cancer patients to access psilocybin within a medical context, and that actually is definitely ahead of the curve here in the U.S. and it seems like the Canadian government has been increasingly supporting those exemptions.
Perhaps I should ask you to define psilocybin. I assume this is, we're talking about matter, a substance that is part of fungus, a mushroom. Is that right?
Yeah, psilocybin is the active chemical in what's called magic mushrooms, are responsible for at least the majority of the psychoactive effects.
I see. I have a question about psilocybin that's come in from one of our webinar attendees. As far as psilocybin is concerned, this attendee asks, what do you feel are the relative merits of the whole mushroom versus synthetic forms of the active ingredients in terms of, therapeutic use?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I think it's still an open question. Of course, Western medicine, based on kind of a reductionist principles, prefers to study isolated compounds, and so we see this with psilocybin being the sort of thing that gets pulled out of the mushroom and then being studied on its own, the way medicine has done for so many other with many other plant-based medicines, finding out what's the active ingredient. And sometimes it's a single compound, but in so many cases with plants, you have something called an entourage effect, which is actually when multiple different compounds and alkaloids within a plant actually synergize to create effects that it's not just, it's, when things are more than the sum of their parts. A plus B just doesn't equal C, but A plus B combines to give you D, actually. And so that's actually one of the things that's considered with cannabis, for instance, is that it's not just THC, the one active ingredient. You have several different cannabinoids as well as terpenes and all of these different compounds in the plant that actually determine the effect. It's not, so it's this interplay of things. And actually ayahuasca, which I mentioned, is in most instances a combination of two different plants, and both are necessary for the effects that you get. So that's another example of entourage effect. As far as for this person's question,
Yes.
with mushrooms, there are other compounds within psilocybin genus mushrooms that some people feel like may contribute or modulate the effects of psilocybin. I think it's pretty clear psilocybin is responsible for the majority of the effects, but
Yes.
are they equivalent? It's hard to say.
Yes.
The answer to that, and of course, so much of it actually depends on the meaning for the individual person, is what I would say is, I think, the most meaningful, maybe even beyond that chemical entourage. Is is it meaningful for someone to actually consume a natural product like a mushroom as opposed to a synthetic pill? Maybe those two things hold different meanings for people, and so that alone could influence the effect.
Yeah. The person who posed that question is Janice Hughes. Thank you very much, Janice, for that question. I wanted to ask, we're speaking of therapeutic uses of either these synthetic extracts or, the whole mushroom or the whole plant. Let me ask you, Jordan, about what therapeutic uses you and other researchers and practitioners find most promising. Are we using these psychedelic substances to treat mental health disorders, mental health challenges, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder? Are they being used in palliative care situations? All of the above? Where are the most promising therapeutics these days?
Great question, and I think this relates to some of the real promise and intrigue around psychedelic medicines, is that they're actually being studied currently for a very wide range of conditions, which is very peculiar, actually, and has in some ways also, at least on the scientific side, raises some really interesting questions about mechanism or how is, because to answer your question, psychedelics, even dating back to the 50s and 60s, some of the earliest, most promising uses from that area were in treating substance use disorders like alcoholism, and in treating existential distress related to end of life, like in end of life and cancer patients. And those actually now, so in this current era of research, both of those areas have had some significant phase 2 level studies that are very promising areas, but other areas that are being studied and appear to have some promise include depression, which is the thing that I have studied the most, anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder with especially MDMA therapy. That most likely will, at least in the US, be the first
MDMA therapy. Could you just define that, please? Or that's
yes. So both, so when I talk about psychedelic medicine, I am the thing I have spent most of my time looking at and most interested in is psychedelic assisted therapy. And so by that, we're talking about this interesting model of combining these substances with therapy and having these experiences within a therapeutic context, but also it's psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So the psychedelic is assisting a psychotherapeutic process. in these cases. So it's more than just a drug treatment. I think that's very important. It's not just, oh, this is a miracle drug and, all I have to do is take this substance. It's very clear that,
Yes.
Psychedelics can be used in a range of contexts, and I have no personal problem with psychedelics being used in a range of contexts. But when we're talking about using it for sort of these medical purposes with to treat specific diagnoses, we're talking about this, especially mental health diagnoses. This model of combining the medication and those experiences with psychotherapy and doing it in a psychotherapeutic manner. That may not be necessary or desirable for all conditions. And actually, a close colleague of mine at Yale has been studying psilocybin for the treatment of headache disorders.
Yes.
And now that is not so much that's being done more in a bit more of a pharmacologic model,
Yes.
where the experience and therapy is not seen as critical. But for most of the mental health conditions, and as I mentioned, for substance use disorders, depression, for trauma, for obsessive compulsive disorder, for actually eating disorders, all of these things are being looked at, and generally it's considered still that it's the combination of the pharmacology, the experience, and the therapy that is potentially responsible for the treatment effects, and that we can harness. Now, my feeling about it is that what these medicines share in common, and why there's a lot of theories of why they're applicable in different conditions, but having access to an altered state of consciousness, which is what these medications allow for, allows us to tap into different processes that we're not able to access in regular consciousness. And so a good example is actually, to get back to MDMA assisted therapy, which you asked about. So that's using MDMA or ecstasy in combination with, in a psychotherapeutic context, for the treatment of trauma.
Yes.
And the reason that's effective is because the alteration of consciousness that MDMA engenders is one that it allows people to sort of takes their fear systems offline. There's oxytocin, which allows for bonding and an open-hearted kind of feelings with the therapist, and so people are able to process their trauma under that medication in a way that is usually far too difficult or triggering to do without the medication. And so within those single sessions, people are actually able to go directly to do some therapeutic work that normally they wouldn't be able to do. And I would argue something similar occurs with psilocybin for depression in these other conditions that we work with people in to really go into the heart of the issues.
One of our webinar participants, Phyllis Webster, asks about which kinds of psychiatric illnesses respond well to these psychedelic drugs, and you've been speaking to some of this already. Your work on depression. The questioner asks, "What about someone? Have these medicines ever been used in any sort of clinical trials with people who are suffering from bipolar disorder, for instance?"
So yes, and again, I do want to say a caveat that for a lot of these indications, the studies are still in quite early phases. Yes. Though the ones that are the furthest ahead is MDMA for trauma, which is most likely will be actually FDA approved within a couple of years. And
Jordan,
then
I'm sorry to interrupt, Jordan. When you say trauma, we're not speaking of physical trauma. We're speaking of emotional trauma. Yes.
People diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, which could be the result of, a range of traumatic experiences.
Thank you.
And as I meant, actually, psilocybin for alcohol use disorder has now some pretty strong data behind it, and depression increasingly. So those are kind of the leading ones, and then, as I said, a lot of other things are being investigated but are much earlier. Yes. Including for bipolar depression, I believe there's one study Though again, the field has started kind of conservatively. So for
Yes.
most of the studies screened out people with bipolar disorder just due to fear that it could destabilize
Yes.
them.
So some of our webinar participants are keen to ask you some very big and challenging questions. So here's a very big question from Aaron Stranger. Do you think that the healthcare system should be the gatekeeper for access to these medicines, or should that access rest with Indigenous populations that seek accessibility?
So it's a great question, Aaron. And I think what I'd say is that I actually hope that it shouldn't be an either or situation. I alluded to that I myself am a proponent for sort of a psychedelic ecosystem in which these medicines can safely be accessed through different means. And so absolutely, Indigenous groups, those that have traditions of using these medicines, should absolutely be able to practice and have religious freedom, and that exists in there's the Native American Church, as well as some ayahuasca churches that have that, and that those rights should increasingly be should be there. I think it's about. So I think the interesting thing right now is that society is kind of grappling with how do we integrate these drugs or these medicines into our society, and can we actually do this safely? Yes. And is the medical system the only place where psychedelics can, should that be the only gatekeeper? I personally don't think so. I think we're seeing a process a little bit like what happened with cannabis, where medical uses of cannabis kind of opened up the social consciousness to broader uses, and then led to further legislative changes. And yes, I think to some degree that may happen, that the legitimization of psychedelics through the medical system has been seen as kind of the leading edge, and I think is again an important use. Yes. However, I mean, my personal political views are that certainly decriminalization makes a lot of sense. I don't believe anyone should be criminalized for personal use of really any substance. Yes. And then we're seeing what's really interesting in Oregon and Colorado and different municipalities, different experiments happening now, social experiments for how can we psychedelics do come with risks. Let's be clear about that, but so do so many other activities that we permit in society, like driving automobiles and drinking alcohol and smoking cigarettes. And so can we put evidence-based and reasonable frameworks around these medicines so they can be safely incorporated into society? Yes. And and to your question, can Indigenous groups have safe access to them? Yes. And it's part of the issue with the current framework is actually that Indigenous groups don't have access to their own medicines, and that's an issue with peyote in the Native American Church. Yes. As well as ayahuasca, being so importing these. So we need to create common sense frameworks.
Jordan, you mentioned that much of the research being done on psychedelics right now is at an early stage. One of our webinar attendees, Stephen Dingwall, asks how this research and treatment using psychedelics is carried out. The psychedelics that are being tested right now, it's through standard clinical trial protocols, right? Yes. Again, because they're Schedule 1, 2, they're all through clinical trial protocols, but what those protocols look like are very different and can range from these more, there's been studies that have put people in scanners to understand, the effects in the brain, but most of the therapeutic studies, again, have taken place in kind of rooms that have more of like a living room kind of environment, try to create a positive setting, make sure you have a good relationship with your therapists or facilitators ahead of time to try to maximize the work that can be done within those sessions. And again, the difference here is that most trials with these medicines have
only include 1, 2, or 3 exposures to the medication. This isn't ongoing treatment. This is like a very limited treatment model, and I mean, I think that that's not going to work for a lot of people, but like people may need somewhat more frequent sessions. But again, the model is quite different as far as having these limited, powerful kind of exposures, and then have ongoing therapeutic work outside those drug sessions.
So, Jordan, our time together is fast drawing to a close. We have just 5 more minutes, and the questions are coming in. To those whose questions I won't be able to get to in the time remaining, please accept my apologies. But I will try to get through a few more. Here is one from someone we've spoken about earlier, George Fulford, who is asking, do some psychedelic medicines combined with appropriate psychotherapy have an impact on neuroplasticity? And if so, how can it be determined? And perhaps you could also define neuroplasticity for our webinar attendees, Jordan.
Sure. And George is clearly informed in this topic, because that's one of the leading sort of biological theories of how. So again, there's interest in, well, how is it that these limited exposures to psychedelics have long-lasting impacts? And some of that we can think about as on a psychological therapeutic kind of level, and then some of that we can think about on the biological level. And so neuroplasticity really just broadly refers to inducing changes in the brain. Sometimes, so not all neuroplasticity is good, even though it's thought to be generally favorable. But broadly, we're talking about when we're able to forge new neural connections in the brain, and that can be actually on the cellular level. Just, do we see the neurons actually branching out? Do we see more different networks communicating with one another?
Yes.
For instance, and so yes, there is, and that was one of the things we were interested in my study at Yale. So we have to finish my overall, the arc of the story. But so the question is actually still, most of the evidence for neuroplasticity is in either cell models or in rodent models, and less so in humans. So it's still an open question, though that is, it seems to be the case that psychedelics, including ketamine, actually promote neuroplasticity for a certain amount of time. And my own research showed that over a 2-week period following exposure to psilocybin. And so we think that maybe combining that biological effect and then doing therapy during that sort of window of neuroplasticity is what may be responsible for the potential therapeutic benefits.
Thank you, Jordan. So Jordan, you're not just a clinical instructor in the Yale Department of Psychiatry, you're also a co-director of a clinic known as West Rock Wellness. Is it in New Haven, Connecticut?
It is. It is. Yeah.
And tell me, before we close, before we have to come to a close, tell me a little bit about the clinic, how it came to be, if it was your idea or an idea that you hatched with a colleague, and what is the role, if any, of therapies with psychedelics? What sort of role do psychedelic therapies have in the treatment regimens that you offer in your clinic?
Thanks, Fred. Yeah, and so this will give me a nice chance to round out the arc that you dragged out my whole biography here. So I entered residency. I got involved in doing this research with psilocybin that I was focused on. I want to run a study like that, and was pursuing that. And really, it was such an incredible experience to actually facilitate for the participants who came into the study. And I ended up being able to do that for another study as well for depression, and overall got to work with about 30 people in total. Just so moving and powerful and extremely gratifying work. and then, you know, I did have this interest in having a broad approach to wellness that tied into some of my other interests. So, you know, as far as combining not only psychedelic therapy, talk therapy, and then other modalities, yoga, meditation, how do we also put together a holistic package to support people's wellness? And so while I was in residency, I actually wrote a book chapter about this model clinic idea that I had, that was just kind of an exercise in idealism, but was kind of putting together, well, you know, what would it really look like to sort of, again, have it all, like to be able to use these medicines in a supportive context, one where we could do research, we could do training, we could put sort of everything together in one place, which, and unfortunately in academia, I was seeing there's, you know, a lot of strengths in academia, and certainly for doing clinical research. I mean, that requires huge amounts of resources, but there's also restrictions. And as far as the practice settings for actually treating patients, you know, is either, as I said, you know, at least here was like, you know, the VA hospital, the teaching hospital. It was discrete settings that each have their own culture, and you know, you can influence things a little bit, but to really, I wanted to have a place where I could create my own model of care and kind of put all these different elements together. And so I had that idea. I wrote this book chapter in that you can find in one of the book edited by Bia Labate and on psychedelic medicines. And anyway, over the years, I found colleagues who also shared a similar vision, and one of them was a therapist in my psilocybin study, Dr. Kilpatrick, and then Dr. Hokinson being another psychiatrist that we worked together, and also had an interest in integrative psychiatry. And I've been dreaming about this with my wife as well, and some other colleagues here in New Haven. And so over the past few years, we were laying the groundwork to open up such a practice, and we've been working towards it for several years, and we just actually opened a couple of weeks ago, and it's sort of a slow opening. Our website should be going live this week. It'll be westrockwellness.com.
I was going to ask you about the website because I was looking for it, but the place is so new that the website isn't yet online, is it?
Right. It literally, I believe, by the end of the week might be up, but it's not there yet. So yeah, this is brand new. It's a whole different venture, you know, outside of academia and creating these models. And it's a lot of work, but it's also really exciting to, again, have a place where we can define the model that we want to use to treat people and not be limited by, of course, we're bumping up against, there's always limitations, but having that flexibility to at least not externally impose, not have anyone say, well, I want you to see 20 patients in a day and you can only see a patient for 15 minutes. It's like, no, these treatment models are pretty unconventional. We offer so ketamine assisted psychotherapy, because ketamine is the one psychedelic, again, not a classical psychedelic, but that is actually available for clinical use. It's not Schedule 1, it's still scheduled, but we can use it off label for depression, trauma, et cetera. And we use it in much the same way that I described how we were doing other psychedelic therapy. And those are often 3 to 4 hour sessions with people, again, using ketamine's consciousness altering properties and combining it with therapy. So it's a pretty unconventional way of doing things at this point. And so my feeling was we needed to create a place where we could actually do those things. And so
Jordan, this is very exciting and very inspiring. And you have been so generous with your time this evening. We are in fact out of time. So to all of those who have attended this really stimulating webinar, thank you so much. To those who typed in some questions in the chat window that I was unable to get to, please accept my apologies. But Jordan is out there and he is reachable. And, as a UW alum, I'm sure he'd love to hear from you if you wanted to follow up with a question or so. We will look forward to, the website and to hear further developments about West Rock Wellness. I'm looking forward to checking out the website when it's available. Please give us the URL. We know that it's not live yet, but when it will be, what is the URL, Jordan?
It will be westrockwellness.com.
Okay, that's easy to understand. So, Jordan Sloshower, thank you so much for this really stimulating chat. The time just blew by. So thank you, and thanks to Judith and to the rest of the U of W Alumni Council. Thanks to Media Services at the University of Winnipeg and Ethan. And from me, Fred Appel, member of the U of W Alumni Council, thank you for attending this webinar and the other discussions we've had with some very distinguished U of W alums based in the United States. Have a pleasant evening, everyone.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Take care, everyone.